Welcome back, colleagues. It's good to be with you. My name is John. This is Learn Extra Teacher Talk. Our focus today is on physical sciences. And today in the studio, I have Angela Stott from UCT, and she's come to share with us some of her research findings and some of practical ideas around the misconceptions that many people have about force. So, force misconceptions. What is a misconception, Angela?
Well, what I mean by a misconception is an idea that doesn't fit with the scientific idea.
Okay.
Some people don't like the word, and they rather refer to it as alternative conceptions or naive conceptions because they don't want to make a judgment that it's bad. But, well, politics aside, it's just simpler to say misconceptions, I think.
So things aren't quite clear. They're alternative to what everybody else thinks.
Not to what everyone else thinks, to what scientists think.
What scientists think.
That's
okay, right. And are these quite common? I mean...
Extremely common, yes. Especially, I think, in the area of force. Throughout the world, amongst various age groups, even people with university degrees, even with BScs, you still get these misconceptions very strong, very prevalent.
So it's not an indictment, something to be ashamed of. If you've come across a misconception that you hold yourself, it's not something to be afraid of, but rather to deal with.
I think it's important that every teacher and every learner, of course, is continually examining their understanding and being aware that they can very well have misconceptions and being a learner, having that attitude of wanting to learn.
Okay, so you've said that high prevalence of misconceptions, but you've got a little story to tell us about those misconceptions and where they come from.
So just to explain why misconceptions are so prevalent, this is an example of why this is so. It's from a story called Fisher's Fish. And the story says that there was a minnow and a tadpole that grew up together in a pond. And they played together. Then the tadpole grew legs and he left the pond. And then he came back after a while to visit the minnow. And he told the minnow all the stories of what he'd seen in the big wide world above the pond. And as he described it, then the minnow formed an idea in his mind what he was describing. So he described about birds that are colourful and that can fly. So this is what the minnow thought he was meaning. And then he described about things called cows, which have horns and they carry around pink milk sacks. And so then, of course, the minnow thought of fish with horns and others. And he described people and, again, it came out funny. So the point is that people and fish, according to this, have prior knowledge. And then when they go into an instruction environment, they're taught, then the teacher brings in some other information, and then the learner must somehow, reconcile the two. And so sometimes what happens when they do that reconciling is there's a very strange thing that happens in the mind, and the teacher might not have a clue of what that picture is in the learner's mind.
And so we don't have fish as fish, but people as fish, or a misconception, a misunderstanding, and one can understand how that develops. Yeah. So specifically, your question was around, or your investigation was based on research.
Yes.
and around force misconceptions.
Yes.
So talk us through the findings of your research, or what you've found in terms of the prevalence.
So I had two questions that I wanted to answer. One was, how prevalent are various kinds of misconceptions amongst teachers in South Africa? And then, of course, what can we do about it? So first of all, I divided the force misconceptions into categories, and one I was particularly focusing on, and that's called impetus, and what that is will become clearer as we speak.
Yes.
But that misconception was extremely prevalent amongst teachers. You can see in this graph the white is no misconceptions detected for that, so they didn't get any mistakes in the test to do with that misconception, and it was only 12% of the teachers. So you can see that the majority of the teachers on the test seem to have the misconception. Even if we say, okay, maybe you make one mistake just by accident, even so, that was only 12% who made just one mistake. 76% made more than one mistake. There were 9 mistakes that they could make in total for this particular misconception. And so, you know, it clearly is a big problem amongst teachers. Now, I also tested for other misconceptions. In this graph, this next graph, I just lumped them together. And you can see that they're not as prevalent, not as bad, but even so, it's still fairly bad, because these are all grade 12 physical science teachers, and they're teaching Newton's laws. It's part of the syllabus, of course. And so if we allow them to make one mistake on this section, then 40% seem not to understand very well.
So this area here...
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's arbitrary where you decide on your cutoff, but, you know, roughly you can see that there is a problem.
Yes. And was this excluding impetus, or
yes? This graph is for all the other
types of force misconceptions that you were looking at.
Yeah.
And how big was the sample? I mean, was it?
Yes, I travelled around the whole country last year, and I had contact with about 2,000 teachers. Some of them didn't give complete data, so my data sample maybe is more about like 1,500.
That's still a substantial sample. I mean, yes. It's not just 15 people in a workshop.
And it was from a variety of teachers, some from rural, from urban, from a variety of kinds of schools. So it was fairly representative, I believe, of South Africa's population. Of course, it was a convenient sample, so I'm not claiming that it is perfectly representative, but I think it gives us the idea that there is a need for some intervention here.
Yeah. So, as we go on, let's have a look at these were the questions that you were asking.
There are 2 questions.
There are 2 questions.
Of the 13.
So let's have a look at these questions, and this was part of what you administered as part of your research. So we say a person throws a ball straight up into the air, and you've got a little diagram there to show that as well. A small way. A ball is now on its way up. The force on the ball is... And we've got the option of A, with the arrow pointing downwards, B, the arrow pointing upwards, C, a long arrow pointing up and a smaller arrow pointing down, and D, saying no force. And then the second question that you had was this one, was a soccer ball has been kicked towards the goal. As it moves through the goal posts, so we see there it is, what forces are acting on it? And there are a number of options. The option of friction, gravitational force, normal force, and the force of the kick, being A. B, friction, gravitational force, and the force of the kick, gravitational force, and the force of the kick, friction, gravitational force, and the normal force, the normal force, the force of the kick. Okay, so that's quite an interesting range, and maybe we'd just like to take one more look at that and give you a second to have a look at those. What options do you think? And maybe it's not a trick question, it's just an idea for us to explain and to have a look at the question again and say, what answer do you think is the most correct? That's the first one, we've got it up on the screen. And the second one, the soccer ball. Well, Angela, take us through it, because I think we've given the viewers time to look at it.
All right, so the correct answer for the first question is A, but most people answer either B or C because
so this is the popular one here.
And yeah, both of those. Because I think they have the impetus misconception, which says that the force of the hands, the force that the hand applies is still acting.
Okay.
So it's moving upwards, so there must be a force pushing it upwards.
So a relationship between force and motion.
Rather than force and acceleration. Because according to Newton's first law and second law, you can't get acceleration without force. And so what happens is, while you're touching the ball and you're pushing the ball up, you are applying a force. And it's accelerating in the direction of that applied force. It's accelerating upwards. Then you stop touching the ball still has energy or momentum, which you gave it while you were pushing it up, so it continues to move up. But now your force is no longer acting. Gravitational force is the only force, well, if we ignore air resistance. Acting, and so therefore it's actually accelerating downward while moving upward, and that's a big problem. I noticed that even, you know, the teachers that I met, most of them would argue that if it's moving upwards, it has to have a force acting upwards, because isn't that what Newton's first law says? And no, it doesn't, because Newton's first law says that if the force is
constant velocity.
Yeah, so if the force is downward, it's accelerating downwards, not necessarily moving downward.
Yeah.
So it is actually accelerating downwards while moving upwards. That's why it gets slower and slower.
Because at the maximum height, it's zero. It's stopped.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Then the next question, the correct answer is the one which doesn't have the force of the kick. All the others have the force of the kick.
Yeah.
So D is the right answer. And here again, this probes for impetus, because people think that, okay, it's moving that way, so something must be pushing it that way. What is pushing it that way? The force that I gave it when I kicked it. But you're no longer touching it, and the force of kick is an applied force. It can only act while you're touching the ball. So although it's moving that way, it's not accelerating that way. The only force, if this is horizontal, acting horizontally on it, is friction, and that's in the opposite direction to motion, and so it's actually accelerating in the opposite direction to motion. That's why it's slowing.
One can see why teachers and learners battle with this concept. But the question is, well, what are we going to do about it? And is it easy to correct? And how can we correct it?
Now, it's very difficult to correct. These misconceptions are not only prevalent, they're also resistant to instruction, especially traditional instruction. This slide just shows you, maybe I can just define what I mean by impetus before we go on to, you know, why is it so prevalent and so difficult to correct. So impetus is the idea that a force, an applied force, continues to act even though you're no longer applying the force. So here we've got this lorry, nobody's pushing it, but it's still moving. So the person thinks that it's still being pushed by my force that I applied in the past. So let's just look at a little story here about Johnny there. Now, when Johnny was little, he'd play with these lorries, and he knows, you know, you push it and then it goes and stuff like that. Then Johnny went to school, and by the time he got to grade 11, he had his teacher here teaching him about Newton's laws. And so first of all, Johnny wasn't very interested, and he didn't really think about very much. But then as the teacher started speaking about this, then Johnny started realizing, hey, well, this does have a bit of a link to my playing with these lorries when I was little. So the teacher says, okay, force is a push or pull. Yes, Johnny knows. Yes, I pushed and pulled my lorry, so that's what that was. Right, then the teacher says, you need a force for acceleration. Force causes acceleration. Now, Johnny has previously learned the definition of acceleration. He can write it in a test, but that doesn't really have anything to do with real life. So that's compartmentalized and not being accessed now. In real life, what does he know about acceleration? Well, you press the pedal in the car to make it go. So acceleration and movement are roughly the same thing to him. So now he translates in his mind, the teacher saying, you need a force to make the thing go. Yes, that's fine, he knows. You've got to apply a force to make it go. And so then he thinks, maybe not even explicitly, he thinks, well, what about when the lorry now goes away from his hand? It's still going, so there must still be a force. It's going slower, so maybe that force that I gave it is being used up. And the teacher says, so when there's no force acting, no resultant force, then there's no acceleration. So Johnny thinks, yeah, I know that. When now that force is used up, my lorry stops. It's not moving anymore, Teacher says to the learners, do you understand? And Johnny, he says yes, because he thinks he does.
Yeah. And it's like the fish, isn't it? But here he's taking the words that the teacher has said, and he's applying it to his mental construct, his picture in his head.
Now, I told the story to a group of teachers earlier this year, and I asked them, what's the problem? And the majority of them answered me, Johnny isn't listening. And that's not true. Johnny is listening. The minnow was listening too.
Yes.
It's not a matter of not listening. I think it's the teacher who's not listening. He's not listening to Johnny say what's happening in his mind. And so he's not adjusting his teaching to accommodate that and, to remedy that.
Sure. So then the theory, the background of this theory, the picture that Johnny has in his head, teachers obviously need to be aware of that.
That's right.
Won't you take us through?
Yeah. So I think really the important thing is one needs dialogue, not just the teacher standing in the front and speaking. We have to understand that learning is a process of constructing knowledge. You can't just transmit knowledge. So to understand this, we start off looking at Piaget's theories. Now, he said that learning is moving between a state of equilibrium where you feel okay and disequilibrium where you feel uncomfortable. And when a learner is presented with new information, then that new information might be compatible with what he already knows, and so then he doesn't feel uncomfortable. He remains in equilibrium and he just takes in that information, he assimilates. Now that's actually what's happening in both the fish and Johnny. They're not realizing that actually the information they're getting is not really compatible with their understanding. So they're just assimilating it and fitting it in somehow into their understanding.
But it's a jumble.
And that's creating the misconception.
And that's where the misconception
that's
arises.
Right. Now, if the learner can be made to realize that the new information is incompatible with their understanding, then they experience disequilibration. They feel there's something wrong. It's also called cognitive dissonance. And so then they realize something's got to change. And hopefully, they change their understanding so that the new information can fit into their understanding because it's been modified. Their understanding's been modified. Often that doesn't happen. Instead, they avoid it or they change the incoming information. So it's quite complex to know how do we actually get them to learn right.
Okay.
So a very popular theory, it was proposed in the 80s, is conceptual change theory. And according to this, every idea that you have in your mind has a certain status, so a certain level of importance. And that's determined by these three criteria, whether it's intelligible, plausible, and fruitful, meaning whether you understand it, whether it makes sense to you.
Plausible.
And whether it's useful, fruitful.
Okay.
And so the trick is, for teachers, is to make learners dissatisfied with those everyday misconceptions they have, so that they don't think it's as plausible, intelligible, and fruitful as the scientific one, so that they lower the status of their misconception, raise the status of the scientific conception. So the first step is just to make them realize, first of all, there isn't a fit between the incoming information and their understanding. There is a problem. And then to make them want to, resolve the problem by accepting the scientific one.
But then that goes down to the idea as well that if teachers are aware of misconceptions, they'll be able to intervene.
Yeah. If you're not aware of it, you don't know what questions to ask to find out if the learners have it.
Yeah.
So I think, and that's what we're getting to, I think the real key is one needs to learn how to ask the right questions to get them telling you what's going on in their head, and then for you to create situations or ask the right questions again or give the right information to make them dissatisfied with what's going on in their head and more satisfied with the scientific explanation.
Okay.
But now, sometimes actually it's not necessary to cause too much cognitive dissonance. In some cases, you can actually make it a bit easier because they do have the right idea, they just have the wrong label.
Okay.
For example, with impetus, if we think back to the ball moving away from the foot, there is something that keeps the ball moving. It's just not force. It's energy or momentum. So another way in which we can help the learners to learn correct scientific conceptions is to find out where they're using the wrong label, and then just make them aware, okay, in scientific language, force is not the right word for that, it's energy. Yes. And then another aspect one has to just bear in mind when you're teaching is that it's not simple that you either have the misconception or you don't. You have it in various contexts, and the status of the misconception and the scientific, it actually varies according to the context. Like, are you writing an exam, or is it in the vertical or horizontal dimension? I've noticed that, for example, with the impetus, sometimes you might help the learner to realize that it doesn't act in the horizontal direction. But then as soon as you get to a vertical question, then they're applying impetus again. So it's not enough to challenge the learners, getting them speaking and stuff like that. You also need to guide them to be able to generalize. And learners are very bad at generalizing. So research has shown, especially weaker learners, you have to explicitly direct their attention to various contexts, and not just expect that if you've taught it to them in the horizontal dimension, for example, that they're going to be able to do it in the vertical. So you need to have a variety of contexts and apply it in all those different contexts.
Okay. So then in terms of this conceptual change idea, those initial constructs, they seem to be resistant to change.
Yes.
So what you're suggesting is, yeah, we need to be aware of them, and we need to be aware of the context, and that they can still remain in different contexts, even though they're resolved in one. But the process, you spoke about dialogue and discussion and questioning, which goes back to something that we dealt with in a previous episode when you were here about the ladder approach.
Yes.
So it's in that scaffolding and that discussion that you're wanting to raise these misconceptions. Is that?
Yes. So that's why group discussion, maybe peer discussion, or even class discussion, all of those are really necessary. But if you just get the kids discussing, just discuss, it's not going to help. You've got to direct them. And that's why you've got to understand what are those misconceptions, and you've got to think, how can I direct them so that the discussion is going to be fruitful, not just chatting.
Yeah. Now, one of the things is the asking of the good question. But you've been developing those good questions as part of iQuiz.
That's right.
Which we're going to talk a little bit about, a little more about after the break. So don't go away. Coming up right after this, we're going to be dealing with a set of questions that Angela's been working on that will help us uncover some of the misconceptions that learners have about force. So we'll see you after the break.